Good afternoon. I'm Rod Hicks, and welcome to another webinar that we are sponsoring at the Society of Professional Journalists on media trust or media distrust. Today's topic is about bias, the belief by some people that news reporters and news organizations slant the news to fit a particular agenda. First, I'm going to introduce our panelists for today, and then I'll talk a bit about our sponsor. First of all, we have Howard Schneider. He is the Executive Director of the Center for News Literacy at Stony Brook University, and Amna Nawaz, who is the Senior National Correspondent for PBS NewsHour. Today's session is sponsored by the Trust Project. The Trust Project is a consortium of top news companies led by award-winning journalist Sally Lehrman that's developing transparency standards to help you easily assess the quality and credibility of journalism. For more than 2 years, the Trust Project researchers interviewed people in the United States and Europe to find out what's important to them when it comes to news. What they found was that people want to know who wrote or produced the story, what expertise they have, and whether the publisher has an agenda. Lehrman took the research and invited top news leaders around the world to build a digital standard that meets people's needs. That standard is known as trust indicators, which are standardized disclosures about a news organization's ethics and other standards for fairness and accuracy, a journalist's background, and the work behind a news story. Leaders from 100 news organizations collaborated to create them. And those organizations are the first to give search engines and social media platforms the consistent technical standards they need to surface quality news. To learn more about the Trust Project, go to thetrustproject.org. I'm gonna let our two panelists introduce themselves. Like I said, I'm Rod Hicks. At SPJ, my job is to help people understand how the news media works with the hopes of them trusting what they read from or see in news media. Howard, you want to give a brief introduction to yourself and what you do?
Sure, I'm Howie Schneider, and I am the Executive Director of the Center for News Literacy at Stony Brook University School of Journalism. And we started the newest journalism school in the country back in 2006. We decided it was no longer sufficient just to train journalists. Given the transformative changes that were occurring in our information landscape, we decided that we had to design a curriculum to train news consumers on how to judge the reliability of the news they see. So we've done that, and in the past decade, we have taught more than 11,000 undergraduates at Stony Brook. The course, elements of the course are now at 25 other universities and in 15 countries. Prior to coming to Stony Brook, I was the editor of Newsday on Long Island, and I was a reporter and an editor for about 3 decades.
Very good, very good. Amna Nawaz.
Hi, Rod. Thanks so much for having me, Howie. Really good to be with you. And thanks to everybody out there who's joining us today. I'm Amna Nawaz. I'm the Senior National Correspondent at the PBS NewsHour. I'm also the primary substitute anchor for the show, subbing in for Judy Woodruff whenever she is off. I cover everything from politics to science to culture to sports to breaking news to foreign affairs for the broadcast. I was previously an anchor and correspondent at ABC News, where I led our coverage of the 2016 election across all of their streaming platforms. And then prior to that, I spent years at NBC News, primarily as a foreign correspondent covering Pakistan and Afghanistan and Syria and Turkey. So issues of bias, issues of fairness, of objectivity are things I daily consider. They're things I weigh and wrestle with every day. And I've been accused by many people of having some kind of bias or being unfair or not being objective in my reporting. It comes with the territory. So it's of grave concern, not just to me, but to all of my colleagues. And I look forward to talking about it and taking your questions.
So as you see, we have our A team today, and we are going to dig into this topic that a lot of people have very strong opinions about. A year ago, in my role at SPJ as Journalist on Call, I conducted a 6-month project in Casper, Wyoming, where I got together about 36 people and met with them regularly to talk about issues related to media distrust, and to find out why many of them didn't trust the news and what specific issues they had. When we asked each of those people who participated what was the number one concern that they had about the news media, they responded by saying overwhelmingly that it was bias, that the news is biased, and that reporters have an agenda. Just last week, the Knight Foundation and Gallup came out with a survey that basically said that this belief that bias is a part of news coverage, a big part of it, it increased. Now we have 73% of the population who believe that the news is biased. 82% of people think that when they see something that is incorrect, they don't consider it a mistake. They think that it is intentional or even made up. That's what you guys are going to have to deal with when you get out in the real world working as journalists. You need to know how people feel about the craft that you are entering. Now, let me just start by asking, let's go to the guy who's in charge of news literacy. When people say that the news is biased, what exactly does that mean?
There are multiple definitions, and this is one of the big problems, Rod. I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding on the part of the public on the question of what bias even is. They believe it's an attempt by the news media to promote an agenda or slant their coverage, but often they confuse it with lots of other things. I, as you know, came out to Casper, Wyoming, and talked to the panel that you were involved in. And It was very interesting to me. I sent them a note before I went out to Casper. And I said, please send me an example of a news story that you think is biased. And I got 10 responses back, and 8 of the responses were basically commentary stories. They were clearly labeled opinion by a commentator or an op-ed columnist. So the public, in that case, confused the idea that commentary was the same as bias, which it's not. Or they confused the idea that if a reporter makes a mistake, that's somehow an indication of bias, which it isn't. Or they confuse the idea that when a news organization makes a judgment, a considered decision about what stories to play and how much attention they should get, that's bias. One of the things we do in news literacy is try to come up with a definition, a common definition, so students can talk about what bias really is and what it isn't. And I often start by trying to disabuse the students of what bias is not.
Amna, you said that you deal with these accusations of bias. Can you talk a little about that in your experience?
Yeah, of course. By that I mean, we get regular feedback, not just from our viewers on the broadcast, our consumers of news online, but these days on social media, you're in direct contact with your audience every day, every hour. And so I read a lot of the things that I get in direct messages and mentions because although it's not necessarily representative, I think it is indicative in some ways of the things people care about and the things that are resonating. And quite frankly, I get accused of, depending on the day and depending on the report and depending on the topic, of being either too liberal or too conservative. taking it too easy on an administration official or going too hard on an administration official. You know, having a certain perspective that I'm presenting on one topic and then accused of showing the opposite perspective the next time I report on it. I think because the audience is so reactive right now, and it is in real time that people are consuming and processing and giving you that feedback, oftentimes whatever that first emotion is that people feel is what they are giving to you. Now, I quite frankly take it as a bit of a badge of honor that if I'm being accused of, you know, being biased against all people, I'm probably doing something right, you know, in terms of the body of my work.
Exactly.
It is something we regularly face, and I'm not alone in that. My colleagues all have similar experiences.
Sure. You know, one of the things that other surveys have found is that the public is pretty much polarized along political lines, and that when they look at a story, one of the things that they're filtering it through is their own political interests and whether they believe, you know, there's a political interest of the journalist that's presenting the story. So how much of a factor has the fact that you can go to something like a conservative media or what people might call liberal media and pretty much find what you want? For example, Fox News, if you want to hear, you know, complimentary news about the president, you're going to find it during the commentary shows on Fox News. If you want to hear people complaining about the president, you will find that on MSNBC. So is that adding to the confusion that people think that there's bias, and this whole idea of having being able to shop around for the type of political leaning that you want, is that healthy for how we do our work as journalists, Howard?
Well, I think there are two factors here, Rod. One is the fact that people can't distinguish between opinion and news. We have not done a good job as journalists in making it clear to the audience that this is news and this is opinion. It becomes almost impossible to distinguish those things on cable television. It becomes almost impossible to distinguish those things on the internet, where you have basically news and commentary running side by side. And so that's confusion number one. And then we are playing into one of our greatest human vulnerabilities, because we all, and this is a problem that we discovered at Stony Brook after a decade of teaching lots of smart college students, one of the biggest barriers to being a good news consumer is being open to information that challenges your assumptions. We are not good at this as people, as human beings. Mm-hmm. It's the way our brain evolved. There was a benefit in seeing patterns and wanting to get confirmation for what we believe. We haven't let go of those. So the ability, A, not to separate news and opinion, and then the idea that we can't really open ourselves up to information that challenges our assumptions, which has now become much more intense in this political lens that we're in, is really a problem that really feeds this notion of bias. The perception of bias is fed by these factors.
Amna, is there anything that you try to do to try to make your audience feel that you're just trying to be as fair as possible and not taking sides? Is there anything that you can do? I'm thinking about these young journalists hearing this. What can you do?
Yeah, there's actually two very simple things that I try to always do and that I encourage other journalists to do. One is to keep it simple. And at the heart of our jobs is to let the facts guide your reporting and to lead your reporting, right? We all make individual decisions about the people that we talk to for our stories, the things that we choose to include or not include as part of our stories. All of those are little individual decisions that go into each of our reports. But if you know at the heart of your work is the idea that the facts are leading what it is that you're reporting, whether it challenges or lines up with what you personally believe or not is totally irrelevant. If you are allowing the facts to lead what you're doing your job. The second part of that, and I think this is more true and more important today than any other time, is transparency. I think when we have the kinds of disclosures about the people that we're talking to that says, I'm bringing you this person and I'm highlighting and featuring his or her voice for the following reasons, but I'm also going to tell you a little bit about this person's background because it's important for you to know the context in which he or she is speaking. I think that goes a long way towards helping to build trust. That way people get a sense of, okay, I'm processing this information. I understand this person worked for a certain administration official or oversaw a certain policy. I can then, as a smart news consumer, process the information through that lens. But transparency, I think, across the board goes a long, long way to helping to build that trust, because then people don't feel as if you're out to pursue some kind of agenda. Tell them what you don't know. Tell them about the fact that you reached out to this person and didn't get a response. Disclose all of that information as part of your story and make it part of the reporting process.
These young future journalists may have been told at some point during their school career that you should strive to be objective in your reporting. Is that a goal that journalists should have, and is it even possible? Amna first.
I'll tell you, my standard is fairness. Accuracy first, and fairness right alongside with that. I think sometimes we get stuck in the terminology of what is it we're really striving for, what's the mission statement, right? Objectivity is one of those, unbiased is one of those, impartiality is another one of those. Fair is simple. Am I being fair? I consider myself to be someone who has a good amount of common sense. Am I being fair? Am I treating this story or this person's story in the same way that I would want my story treated if it were being told? And I think, we try so often to strive for some idea of objectivity in the news media, and that's tripped us up from time to time. There was this great line from the Washington Post media critic, Margaret Sullivan, right, who said impartiality is absolutely a value worth defending, but it doesn't mean that you just walk down the center line with a blindfold on. We're not robots just reporting information back to you as we receive it. We have to analyze and process it too. And so I think, am I being accurate? Am I being fair? And is what I'm telling you necessary? Those have become sort of my guideposts along the way.
I think, Rob,
yeah, go ahead. You address this, and Casper.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize for the young journalists the difference between fairness, balance, and bias. Those are very different concepts. So as Amna said, you want to be fair. You want to basically try to make sure that you're presenting everything in an accurate way. But you want to be fair to the evidence in a story. You don't have to be balanced in every story you write. And what I mean by that is this idea that you have to do almost mathematical equivalency and give both sides equal attention every time you write about a problem or an issue. And I think a lot of reporters get very defensive because the audience will say, you didn't present both sides equally, or you didn't give me as much attention. I think the evidence determines what you do in a story. So if you were doing a story, an obvious extreme example about Holocaust deniers, you would not give equal attention to the deniers and the people who have presented this voluminous evidence that the Holocaust occurred. To give both sides equal weight would be to do something that was unfair to the audience. So one of the things I think young journalists have to be careful about is not getting cowed into doing false equivalency. So where the outcome is uncertain, you have to present both sides. Where the evidence, the reporting takes you, as Amna said, overwhelmingly the facts present a strong case for a particular conclusion, you don't have to apologize in letting that reporting dictate the kind of story you do. So fairness is different than balance. Balance can be important. In some cases, there's a presidential debate, you're going to give equal sides, but it is not the standard that you would use, balance, to create fairness in all cases. And I think that's very important for the students to understand.
Let's go back to this number. 73% of Americans believe that there's bias in the news coverage. That's a huge share of the American public. So is it true? Do they make a good point there? Howie?
I think a couple of things. I think these are the problems as I see it. One, I think there's a tremendous amount of confusion on the part of the public. Part of that confusion is the result of the fact that they are getting lots of news and non-news at the same time. in that study that you referenced from Knight and Gallup, I think it was 70% of the people say that they are overwhelmed by the sheer volume of material they're getting, and from the fact that you're getting multiple kinds of information from both news and non-news outlets. The public is not equipped, Rod, to deal with these problems. We have not done a good job, our educational system, nor as journalists, and it's not surprising, we haven't caught up. We're in the middle of a revolution. We are in the greatest revolution now in communications in 500 years. And we haven't caught up in preparing the audience for that revolution. So there's a great deal of confusion on the part of the audience as to what is news and what isn't news. At the same time, I would tell you that I am concerned about what I think is kind of an intrusion of opinion into a lot of our news columns. We know what's going on cable television. I mean, who is Anderson Cooper? Is he a reporter? Is he a commentator? Is he a correspondent? You know, his body language will convey immediately how he feels about political issues. I see some opinion seeping into the news coverage, in my view, of the New York Times, which is a great newspaper. So I think we're also living in a culture that's a very judgmental culture. You know, what do we do on the internet? We like things. We don't like things, we cancel people, we comment constantly. We are in a culture of assertion where opinions and a judgment now is really paramount. And so I think that's seeping into some of the coverage of what we're doing as journalists, and I think that's very bad. The third factor, and you know, which is obvious, is that many reporters get in trouble outside of the newsroom when they email, they tweet, they go on television, and they give the perception, or more than give it, they basically take a position on things and convey their opinions and attitudes, and that colors the idea that they are possibly fair and unbiased. So I think we have a lot of factors at work here.
You mentioned social media, and I just wonder if part of the problem here is that this idea of what news is confused by what somebody might see on Twitter or Facebook or other social media, or even YouTube, where people, you know, post things that purportedly comes from some news organization, but often it's not. Have you seen, you know what I'm talking about, Amna? You've seen this before. Do you think that adds to some of the confusion?
Undoubtedly. I mean, this goes back to the point Howie's making about the volume of information that's available to people these days. It requires a certain level of literacy to be able to distinguish what's happening when you look at the Wall Street Journal online between its opinion page and its reporting page. It requires a certain level of distinction to say that when I'm watching MSNBC from this hour to this hour, it's news, but then suddenly at this hour, it switches to opinion. To Howie's point, I don't think we've done a good enough job making those separations as well. But on social media, yeah, I think, journalists have drawn their lines in different places in terms of sometimes who they are and the voice that they put out on social media and the job that they do maybe for the outlet where they are employed or where they're reporting. And, I personally have drawn my line probably much further back than a lot of people because I try to speak with one voice. And I do think that the purpose of social media is to add to my reporting, to add value to the conversation, maybe to point people towards other things that I think add value to that reporting and the issue. But my job is not to tell people what to think. My job is to make them want to think about the things that I'm reporting on. So there's a lot of muddying of waters across the various forms of information that you can get. And I'll give you an example. I've heard from someone recently I was having a conversation with who does not work in news, but who I would consider to be an avid news consumer. And she referred to an article that she saw recently and wanted me to take a look at because she had a question about it. And what she forwarded me was not an article. I would not call it a news report. It was not a reported piece of information. It was basically sort of a glorified blog post that had pulled together a lot of different sources, mischaracterized some of the information in there, cited information that was now long outdated. And this is the kind of stuff that I would consider a savvy news consumer to be able to say, this is not a credible source of information, and yet here it was sliding right by this person. And I think there is so much information out there right now that it requires a level of sophistication and a level of time and resources that the everyday consumer doesn't have. You can't be going in and clicking in on every single citation link to make sure that it is the most relevant and the most recent poll or study or whatever. And the credible news sources, I think the onus is on those news sources to somehow figure out how to make those distinctions and be consistent in their reporting so that people continue to come back to them. I don't think this is a thing that's solved with one policy change or one, presentation change on your website. It happens over time.
I also think, Rod, that it's complicated because faced with this volume of information and faced with the need for confirmation bias, the audience is outsourcing its judgment. So how do you make a shortcut? Well, if something's retweeted a lot, or something is liked a lot, or something comes up high on the Google algorithm, or something's trending on YouTube, it must be true. I can believe that. It's reliable. It's not the case. We know that's not the case. Or they use the sender of information and confuse that with the source. So a lot of our students at the university will get something from somebody they trust, and they'll get that link and they'll send it to somebody else because they trust the sender, but they haven't interrogated or cross-examined the original source of the information. And there's studies that show a majority of Americans will retweet something without ever opening up the link to take a look at it. They do it as a shortcut, and they do it because it feeds this idea that these are people who they can trust. But unless we get people to understand that that's not the way they can do things, the sharing on social media is a major, major problem. We have basically, at one point, the news media controlled the distribution. We don't control distribution of information anymore, right?
Right.
The audience.
Every individual has the same power.
And we know that they spread it. And we know the speed of information is a problem. During the 2016 election, I don't know if you know this, Rod, but the Pope endorsed Donald Trump for president, right? In the middle of the election. There was a tweet from the Vatican that we're endorsing Trump. And of course, that tweet was retweeted 860,000 times, I think. Or you'll have to forgive me, but hundreds of thousands of times. The Vatican immediately finds out about this. And the Pope says, oh my God, whatever he says, I'm not endorsing anybody. And they put out a tweet from the real Twitter account that says this is false, and it gets retweeted 30,000 times. Who is going to win that war? When that information gets out, and MIT actually did a study and found out that false information, which is often more sensational, travels 7 times faster on Twitter than reliable information. So the real way to deal with that problem is to head that off before the information is ever spread.
It's a lot of work for a news consumer to do. It's a lot to try to sort out, to try to figure out whether you can trust something or not. One of the things that we heard in Casper, there are some people who said that all they want from a news organization is the facts. And when you do anything more than that, it indicates your bias. And in talking to some of the people who felt this way, when they see context in a story, or even some type of analysis to try to put a story into perspective, that, in their view, is showing the bias of the journalist. Is there a way to get people to understand the backstory or the context without indicating a bias? Is it possible, or should we just do what they say and don't give you the backstory and don't give you the history, don't give you the context? Is that a legitimate thing for journalists to do? Amna?
I don't think so. And here's why. I can say this from the experience of having been in both circumstances. When I was at the commercial networks, and we often had a minute 30, if that, to tell a complete story about something incredibly complicated, sometimes all you had time to do was report the bare minimum, which was the fact and a sound bite and a little bit of context and another fact, and that was it, and your time was up. The luxury of being at a place like the NewsHour, we've got 6 or 7 minutes for a segment or a report or longer, is that we get to present that context. And I think that context is actually what makes the piece better, because it's not enough for anyone to know what happened. Right. People have to know why it matters, and that's what the context is. I think going back to Howie's earlier point about just on a very basic level, each of us seeking out information that confirms to us what we already believe to be true or what we wish to be true, that context can be offensive to some people, right? If it does not line up with what you thought the conclusion should be, or the way that you thought that things worked, or what you thought about that one particular person. But that context is what makes that report matter to your life and to everybody else's. So if the body of evidence, for example, I'll say in some recent immigration reporting I've done, if I'm reporting on a new procedure, a new policy put into place by the administration to limit the amount of people who are allowed into the country, I can do one of two things. I can either say, today on this date, X date in 2020, the Trump administration put into place this step to limit this many people, and this is the effect that it will have, end of story. Well, what's the end result there? You learn something, but that's not the whole story. I think it's incumbent on me to then say, this is the 15th such step that they've taken this spring alone, or this has now adds to a body of policies that affect this many people. And this is in a pattern of limiting immigration that has taken place since the beginning of this presidency. That is important. It's important for you to understand as a news consumer. It's important for you to understand as a member of the informed citizenry. And so it's not enough just to say, this is the fact, do with it what you will. If that's all you have time for, that's great. But I think the more context and information you have around it, the better.
I also think, Rod, that context becomes crucial in ongoing contentious stories and disputes and issues, social issues. When at Newsday, we were covering the Intifada in the Middle East, and Amna knows a lot about covering these areas, we would be under attack constantly, because one day we would be reporting from the Palestinian side, and one day we would be reporting from the Israeli side, and the Israeli advocates who saw the Palestinian story would say, look, you're only covering it from their perspective, and vice versa. And without context in those stories, saying, while this is going on in this part of the forest, let's remind you what's been happening over time, and let's remind you a little bit about what's happening on the other side of the forest. You lose that. And then it becomes one day this, one day that. And that just feeds this idea that you're taking sides. So when we talk about bias, and we talk about it in news literacy, we define bias as a pattern of unfairness in news coverage over time. So if people come to me and say, your coverage of the Mideast is biased in favor of one side or the other, I will say, as I have, let's look at our news coverage over a period of 3 or 4 months. Let's identify stories that may in fact be unfair for one reason or another. There's a lot of reasons stories may be unfair, bad information, deadline pressure. But if it's biased, you're going to see a pattern over time that indicates that this news organization really does not do a fair job over time. To me, that's bias. And I think the context is really important in defeating this perception as opposed to helping it. And I would just say one more thing, and we had this experience in Casper. Part of the problem is that people, as Amna said, they don't like to see what they don't want to see. Much of what they say is biased. It's just stories they don't like. They don't agree with the story. They don't want to hear something that they don't like. If they're advocates for a political party, they don't want to hear bad news about their party, and they don't want to hear nice things about the other party. It's as simple as that. It's not more complicated. And, you know, we, again, can't be cowed as journalists, and these journalists in the audience can't be cowed into responding to that. We've got to be intellectually courageous enough to say, you know, this is fair, and I believe it's fair, and I'm going to publish it, and I know I'm going to take the heat for publishing it, and people are going to accuse me, but we can stand our ground. And I think that's very important.
I do want to encourage our viewers and participants to send your questions in the Q&A section on the Zoom template. and we do have a few questions in. From time to time, I hear from people in Wyoming and Casper who pass along things that they see. A couple of weeks ago, I got a comment from one of the participants in that project who said that when a news story about the president, they saw a news story about the president, and the reporter reported what the president had said, but then they added this tag on that he said it without evidence. That, he said, shows the bias of the reporter to add that little tag that says that this statement was made without evidence. And I guess I can see if every time somebody says something, you want to challenge it and says that this person said something without evidence, how, you know, people can say, well, why are you're questioning what this person says and not what that person says? What's the reason for doing that, and is it a fair thing to do, Amna?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing we should say is that this particular president and this particular administration has sort of challenged the rules that journalists have worked by for years and years in new and unprecedented ways. And when you've got news sources and organizations like the Washington Post actively tracking how many lies the president has told on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, it's a different ballgame, right? We're not talking about the same kind of information construct we've dealt with in the past. And I think what that's awakened in a lot of journalists who are figuring out how to handle that in a flood of misinformation. Which piece do you pick up on, and what is it that you address that day? What do you choose to focus on or not focus on any particular hour or any particular day or broadcast? And so sometimes, yeah, I do think that analysis is how I would characterize it when you're talking about someone who is not exact with his language necessarily, and who has a habit of presenting information that's sometimes just an idea that has not been run by in a policy format or through the traditional processes that governing usually goes through. It's important to remind people sometimes that this is something we don't have proof for. But if we do have evidence of it, this is what we know about that. And this is why it is supported or not supported.
I will say,
it's important these days.
I will say that in 3 decades of being in this business, it's only in recent years since Donald Trump has become president, have I seen that tag where they say, you know, that the president said without evidence. And, you know, someone could say, why did I not ever see that phrase behind something that Barack Obama said? I mean, politicians, this is across the board. They mislead sometimes, and they say things that are not true sometimes. That is not, that's not something new. But how is it that today, you know, we can say that I mean, Obama didn't have to prove everything that he said, right? I mean, this is the argument that you're going to hear. I mean, what's the answer to that?
Absolutely. And I think, you know, what I would say to that is I would argue we should have been doing this all along. As I said, you know, the rules of engagement and I think the standards to which a lot of journalists help themselves changed with this president. And we should have been doing that for years. And we should be doing it with more people than just the president. We should be doing it across Congress. We should be doing it with all your local elected officials. We should be holding ourselves to that same standard of rigor and fairness with everyone.
Okay, so should the Washington Post have tracked the lies that Barack Obama told, assuming that he told lies? I think, you know, it does seem like the rules are different. And if the rules are different, tell me why the rules need to be different.
Well, I think Amna said, I think the president has changed the equation because of the number of misstatements that he makes that are factual. We're not talking about his opinion. We're talking about factual misstatements. If he says that young children are immune from COVID-19, that's just factually inaccurate and potentially dangerous, right? You want to correct it. I agree we should correct the statements of Joe Biden if he made similar statements. I think that's a very legitimate thing. I would dispute one thing, Rod. I think this has been building for some time. So I think that the Joe McCarthy experience, where Senator McCarthy famously was holding up lists of people who were communists in the State Department, many journalists in the wake of that began to feel that they had to become more than stenographers. And so I think that was building in the 60s. I think you had in the 60s and 70s a lot of reporters challenging the claims of people in power. And that's been something that's been growing. I think it's reached an apex under this president, but I don't think that it hasn't been happening for a long time.
Can I just add to that too, to build on what Howie's saying? I think the judgment for journalists to use that kind of analysis or contextualization at the end of their reporting is when the statement was something of consequence, right? Howie's point, if you're talking about life or death when it comes to a coronavirus or COVID-19 vaccine, if you're talking about the idea of whether or not your vote will count, right? Should we be using mail-in ballots? Is there evidence, sufficient evidence of voter fraud when it comes to these kinds of things? Those are statements presented as if they are factually true. They are statements of significant consequence to the American public, and they deserve to be treated, I think, with a higher degree of rigor and analysis than necessarily saying something like, well, LeBron James is the greatest basketball player of all time. You know, we can disagree about this. I can argue for Michael Jordan or Zion Williamson, but it's not of the same level of consequence. It doesn't carry the same weight with the American public.
And let me just tell you the good news in that poll, that very depressing poll that you were citing this week.
Right. The Night Gallup poll that came out last week.
Yeah.
There was good news in that.
Oh yeah, there was good news in that. And the good news was that 80% of the American people feel that the news media is crucial to democracy, important in America, and they want the news media to hold powerful people accountable.
Right.
There is that kind of foundational support for what the news media does. And we need to reinforce that, and we need to fulfill their expectations. And the young reporters need to go out and fulfill those expectations.
Here's a question from one of our viewers. It says, how can one check for bias in their own articles?
So one of the things I would recommend is that everybody find a good editor. Everybody in life needs a good editor, okay? And one of the problems is we're bypassing some of the editing processes now to get information out quickly. But one of the things you do, you need a check. And the check is other people, other eyes on your stories and your reports. That's very healthy. You know, even in the age of the internet, journalism is a team sport. And it's important you have other people look at your work as a check on what you're doing.
Okay, someone else says, should TV and written journalism put a warning that says opinion or commentary in bold during broadcast or in columns to alert the audience? Would that be enough? In print, commentary is usually labeled opinion or commentary or something similar. But I think this person is asking, should that label remain on the screen the entire time that someone is giving their opinion? I think what she's doing is searching for a way to make it clear to people to clear this up, because what's happening now is not working. What do you think, Amna?
Yeah, to be honest, I think this is something that every network has wrestled with before and continues to wrestle with, because look, as sort of someone who's inside the industry, I know what people who work in broadcast news believe about where journalists broadcast and what it is that they're doing. Someplace like MSNBC, they'll say, well, the news hours are during the day and then it moves into opinion at night. You look at someone like Chris Wallace at Fox News and the way that he does his job versus some of the primetime hosts and the way that they do their jobs. There's clearly a distinction in the information and the way it's presented. The question is, does more need to be done to signpost to people what it is that you're consuming? And I think we can all agree that yes, like if trust has been declining to the degree that it has, and we know that it has, what more can we do as news organizations to make that clear to people? At the same time, I don't know if a label is enough, if that is sufficient, because to your earlier point, what about those contextualizing kinds of lines? Will we be under attack because people will say, well, that was an opinion, that's not just straight news? I think drawing these lines is it's necessary in some way. That's why you have the distinctions that are made online and in print. I don't know, quite frankly, the way that television networks need to be handling it. And I'm really curious to hear what people's ideas are for this, because they think that they're broadcasting it, and they are telling people there's a difference between what you see in this hour and that hour. And I don't know that that's getting across.
We have one of our viewers is asking about a statement that story selection does not necessarily mean bias. Does this mean that there's no universal agreed upon definition of bias? I mean, is that totally illegitimate when someone says what you choose to cover or what you choose not to cover is an indication of your bias?
Yes, I think it's illegitimate.
Is it?
Yeah, I think we're making a judgment, and a judgment is not a bias. I think a judgment is a considered decision that reaches a reasonable conclusion, and it's based on factors. So I'm the editor of a newspaper, and I make a decision each day what we cover and what we don't cover. And I'm thinking, what's important today for my audience? How much space do I have to devote to the news? And I'm making considered decisions in the interests of the public. And I'm also considering my competition and what's interesting and lots of other factors and how much weight to give things. That's not a bias. A bias is a predilection that prevents you from being open to any kind of considered decision about the subject. You are incapable, if you're biased, of being open to evidence. Making a judgment is not the same thing as a bias at all.
Well, Howard, what if the judgment of a news organization is to not run any stories that deal with climate change? At least none of the stories that suggest that it's real and it exists. The omission of stories, the deliberate omission of stories like that is not bias?
Absolutely. So if you can demonstrate a pattern, and when you asked before about what's the definition of bias, and I think definitions matter here, definitions absolutely matter, language matters. If you look at a definition of bias as a pattern of unfairness over time, and you get a news outlet that deliberately censors important news from the public, okay? And they do it on a consistent basis, you have an absolute legitimate reason to say there's a bias there. But if it makes a decision on a given day about how much attention to give a particular story, and the story about climate change does not get as much attention as you think it should, that's not an indication of bias.
Can I just add to that, though? I think the danger in newsrooms and where that judgment could become somewhat biased is when you don't have enough and diverse voices participating in that conversation that leads to the judgment, right? If everyone arrives at the editorial meeting and the editorial table and has the same idea about what the most important story is and the way that it should be covered and the time that should be devoted to it, your newsroom has a problem. And so I think there is, in certain newsrooms, very much that problem, right? That we recruit from a certain kind of background, that sometimes it takes a certain level of education or a certain background to be able to get access to some of the industry outlets. And so that what I would say is actually a very real problem across the news industry, and that we have to actively work towards to make sure that we don't let that bias become real.
I would agree with that. I would think that there is something that's kind of an institutional bias, Rod. It's not a deliberate bias. It's a famous story of a woman who called the Chicago newspaper, about 10 or 15 years ago, and said, "How come no women are dying in Chicago?" And the editor said, "What do you mean there are no women dying in Chicago?" And she said, "Well, I pick up your obit page every day and I don't see any women who are dying." And she raised the whole question of why women are not getting attention. And the editor was very defensive initially, which is a mistake for reporters. You need to be open. And the editor said, "Well, many of the people dying are older and they're male and they achieved more and women didn't. It was cultural. And, when you looked at it, there were many women who deserved that kind of attention who were not getting it." And so there is that institutional factor. And I agree with Amna, you need to have diverse voices that raise those questions.
How you might remember this, there was an exchange that you had with one of the Casper participants who insists that the owner of a news organization would be focused on those topics that were in his or her interests and avoiding those that are not. We have someone who's bringing up, and this actually did come up in Casper, having somebody like Jeff Bezos, who owns the Washington Post, and he also has, one of the most popular companies in the country, if not the world, Amazon. And can I realistically believe that Amazon is being covered as aggressively as other businesses and other topics that raise, because the owner of the newspaper owns that big company?
I think you have to look at the coverage. I think, if you talk to the editor of the Washington Post, Marty Barron, he has said publicly several times that Bezos does not direct or influence the coverage of the newspaper. But you'd have to look at what they've covered in terms of their coverage of Amazon against the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal to see whether they've been as aggressive as possible, even if it's kind of a self-censorship. I don't think Jeff Bezos is on the phone telling Marty Barron what to do. But does the newsroom have a self-censorship? I don't think they do. Most newspapers have always been owned privately. That's the model in America. And I think in most news organizations, there is a separation. On the other hand, I'm not sure ABC was covering Disney the way it should have. And I think there are some questions that you could raise. But the proof is in actually looking at how they cover Amazon versus other news organizations.
But I don't know, if you own a big company, would it be a good investment for you to buy a news organization so that you could control the message that gets out about your company? I mean, as you know, a lot of news organizations have parent companies that are into other businesses. So is this going to be a trend that a big company owns the news organization, and there's an expectation that despite that big company is going to be covered fairly? And I don't know, maybe Jeff Bezos doesn't get involved in the Washington Post coverage of Amazon, but what about other people who might even buy a news organization for that purpose?
Well, every time that's happened recently, the journalists in the newsroom have blown the whistle. It happened in Las Vegas, and several of the journalists immediately jumped up and said, we're not being allowed to cover what we should be covering. So I think there is some check and balance here, Rod, and I rely on the integrity of the journalists to immediately raise their hand and say, something's going on here we don't like, whether we resign or raise it. And so I hope that will happen, and that will be a check on any kind of effort of that kind.
Did you want to comment on that, Amna?
Yeah, I just couldn't agree more with what Nawaz's saying. It goes to the body of the work, it goes to the journalism itself, and it goes to whether or not there is a pattern there. And oftentimes the perception is very different from the reality. And this goes back to, I can say, my early years at NBC, back when they were owned by GE, we would face criticism all the time about not doing enough critical coverage of the company, and later with Comcast. That's part of the game. And until we figure out another way to fund good journalism in this country, I think that's always going to be part of the conversation. The question we should be asking is that reflected in the journalism? And I can tell you, as a journalist who has worked at commercial networks, I've never felt that pressure. I have never had my work censored or told that I couldn't pursue a certain story because of the way that it could reflect upon the parent company.
Yeah, somebody just gave the example of Bloomberg, who owns Bloomberg. So when we had our discussion last week, we talked about a lot of things. Is there anything that we're missing that would be helpful to the students watching that? I think we've had a good discussion here.
Yeah, let me, I had, for our journalism students, I had made a top 10 list for things that they could do to try to counter this perception of bias. So I'll go through these quickly, but Amna this will take me a minute. Let the reporting tell the story. Don't opine or characterize. Let the power of the reporting, let the evidence drive the story. In contentious ongoing stories, context is important. Be transparent, as Amna said, about your sources, what you know, how you know it, and what you don't know. Stand your ground. Don't be cowed into false equivalency. Don't be defensive about mistakes. When you make a mistake, admit a mistake, correct and explain it. Be careful what you say on social media or even in public conversations. Be aware of the conflict policies of your news organization, which often says that you can't put yourself in a situation that would compromise the news organization. Listen to the audience and have audience empathy. We're up against very powerful societal forces at work here in creating this perception of bias. Some of it is out of our control, but remember, the audience is really overwhelmed and confused. You'll never please everyone. You're going to take heat. Stay calm, polite. Be careful about that email you send to anybody who gets on the phone or sends you a counter email. Count to 50 before you send, or wait for a day. I used to wait for a day before I sent an email back to a reader. And again, find a good editor. Find people who can help you make sure that your stories are meeting the standards that you need to meet.
Okay. Amna, is there anything you want to?
I will say amen to all of that. I hope Howie puts that out somewhere, maybe in an Instagram story that can be shared multiple times. It's something every journalism student should keep close at hand. And I'll also say, like, the core of this job, right, is being willing to learn. And you're not out to prosecute a case. You're not out to tell the best possible story that you think people want to hear. You have to be skeptical of every single piece of information that you come across, whether it's something you've been reporting on for years or it's your first time reporting on that. And if you're willing to learn along the way, you can't go wrong. If you let the facts lead, you can't go wrong. If you treat your people that you're talking to with empathy, as Howie mentioned, you can't go wrong. And I'll say to you, look, you're going to face criticism. Every single one of us faces criticism. You cannot worry about the response that your story gets when you're reporting it. That cannot get in the way of your work. And you will be asked along the way to pick a side. People will assume that you're on one side or the other. And the thing that I always tell people is I don't have to pick a side when it comes to the information. I'm on the side of the facts, and I'm on the side of decency. And that is how I do my job. And yeah, good luck to all of y'all. We need you more than ever.
We do, we absolutely do.
I think one point that we didn't make is that while trust in the news media has declined fairly significantly since the 1970s, there's also been a trend for a decline in trust in institutions in general. I mean, people don't trust, government. So didn't you speak about this a bit, Howie?
Yeah, we're living in, that's why we're part of a bigger culture here and forces that are at work. And you're right, people now distrust many institutions and are very cynical about those institutions. And that's part of this environment that we are working in. And it's affecting the perception of what we do, as well as what government does and the police do, and lots of other, the courts do, and Congress, and et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, well, Howie, I want to thank you for coming here today and discussing, I imagine, some of the things that happens back at Stony Brook at the Center for News Literacy. And Amna, very happy to have you here to bring your perspective. Tell Judy Woodruff I said hi.
I will do. Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. And so next week, we're going to have our discussion is going to be about sources, the sources that you choose for a news story. And, I know, Howard, you have something on your website about giving people advice about how to select sources. But we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about anonymous sources. We're going to talk about the credibility of sources. We're going to talk about the use of leaked information. And our panelists next week will be Katie Townsend, who's the legal director at Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, Laurie Montgomery, who is the Deputy National News Editor at the Washington Post, and David McCraw, who is the Deputy General Counsel for the New York Times. So we hope to see you next week for that session. I talked to those panelists today, and that's going to be another good session. So thank you guys, and I will see you next week.